She never knocked. She just turned her key and entered my Charleston townhouse as if my name was not on the deed. I thought it was her controlling nature, until I caught her sneaking an appraiser inside. She was not snooping, she was preparing to steal my home. Her biggest mistake was assuming I would smile and sign it away. When I finally invited her back, every hidden camera and financial record was waiting for her to cross the threshold. My name is Parker Sinclair. I am 35 years old, and until recently, I believed my home was the one place no one else could control. I live with my husband, Grant Mercer, in a centuries-old townhouse right in the heart of the South of Broad District in Charleston. It is the kind of house where the floorboards have deep character and the ironwork on the balconies was forged before most modern laws were written. I did not buy this house with Grant. I inherited it from my maternal aunt 3 years before Grant and I even exchanged our vows. The deed bears only my name, a detail I once treated as a formality but would soon understand was the only thing protecting me. I work as the Director of Contracts at North Hollow Infrastructure, a private firm that builds roads and municipal bridges. My job is an arena of high pressure, consisting of 50-page legal documents, strict compliance laws, and non-stop negotiations. It pays extremely well and provides the steady financial stability our household desperately needs. Grant, on the other hand, is currently pouring his energy and my patience into expanding a chain of high-end boutique restaurants with his younger brother. It is a volatile industry, demanding his time, his focus, and most importantly, his constant absence from our home. That absence left a vacuum, and nature abhors a vacuum. In our case, nature took the form of my mother-in-law, Celeste Mercer. When Grant and I got married, giving Celeste a spare key seemed like a reasonable precaution. She lived just 15 minutes away in Mount Pleasant. We gave it to her exclusively for emergencies: a burst water pipe, a locked-out pet sitter, a literal fire. However, Celeste had a very different dictionary, and her definition of a dire emergency was entirely her own. For her, an emergency included walking through my front door unannounced at 8 in the morning on a Tuesday. I would be standing in my kitchen, a mug of black coffee halfway to my lips, wearing my silk robe, only to hear the heavy brass lock turn. She never knocked. The door would simply swing open, and she would glide in, carrying the scent of expensive hairspray and an air of absolute, unquestionable authority. "Oh, you are still in your robe, Parker," she would say, her voice dripping with that particular brand of soft, Southern politeness that serves as a velvet glove over a heavy brass knuckle. I just wanted to drop off these fresh hydrangeas. Though, I must say, the entryway runner looks a bit frayed at the edges. A house this historic deserves proper upkeep. She never yelled. She never said anything explicitly cruel or openly rude. It was always a suggestion draped in maternal concern. She would comment on the shade of the kitchen cabinets, implying the cream color I chose was too sterile for a family. She would pick up a folded tablecloth, sigh quietly, and place it back down as if it were infected with moths. She even criticized the smell of my living room. I favored a sandalwood and fig candle, but Celeste would pinch her nose delicately and remark that proper Charleston homes should smell of fresh citrus and beeswax, not a cheap college dormitory. Every visit, every polite observation, chipped away at my sense of ownership. Despite the deed sitting safely in a secure bank vault downtown, her constant critiques made me feel like an inadequate, temporary tenant renting a space in a home she secretly managed. The most maddening part was that Grant was never there to witness these morning ambushes. He was always at a breakfast meeting with a new investor, touring a potential restaurant location, or had conveniently just stepped out to grab a pastry from the bakery down the street. When I would call him later, my voice tight with frustration and ruined mornings, he would offer the same rehearsed pacifications. "She is just trying to be helpful, Parker," he would say, the sound of city traffic or clinking coffee cups humming in the background. "You know how she is. She loves that old house. She just wants to make sure we are taking care of it properly. Do not let it get to you, please." For a long time, I listened to him, I forced myself to swallow the bitter irritation. I told myself that Celeste was just from a different generation, a perfectionist woman who needed to exert control over her surroundings to feel relevant as she aged. I convinced myself that keeping the peace for the sake of quiet Sunday family dinners was worth the price of a few passive-aggressive comments about my choice of upholstery. I bent over backward to be the accommodating wife, the gracious daughter-in-law who knew how to let things slide. But then the visual inspections morphed into physical trespasses. The quiet unease settled deep in my stomach the day I realized she was no longer just looking, she was touching. I am a creature of strict habit, a trait honed by years of managing dense legal contracts where a single misplaced comma can cost millions. I know exactly where I place my things. I started noticing small, impossible to ignore shifts in my environment. The stack of mail on the console table would be reordered, the financial bills placed precisely on top. The decorative pillows on the sofa would be chopped and arranged differently than how I left them. The silver spoons in the dining room buffet were shifted to an entirely different compartment. These were minor adjustments, but they screamed of a deliberate assertion of territory. The true alarm bells began to ring wildly when her reach extended to my home office. It is a small room on the second floor, a space strictly dedicated to my intense work for North Hollow. One evening, I walked in and found my heavy oak filing cabinet slightly ajar. I always push the drawers flush against the frame, always. Inside that specific cabinet were not just my corporate contracts, but the original blueprints of the townhouse, my property tax records, and the comprehensive insurance policies. Finding that drawer cracked open an inch was a physical violation. It was a silent, arrogant message that no room in my house was off-limits to her prying hands. I wanted to confront her immediately, to change the locks that very night. But Grant made me feel as though I was losing my mind. He accused me of being paranoid, of reading far too much meaning into simple things, of letting the severe stress of my job cloud my judgment. So, I bit my tongue, I waited, I watched. And the quiet dread inside me began to curdle into something incredibly sharp and very cold. The definitive proof arrived on a crisp Monday morning. I had a severe migraine and decided to leave the North Hollow offices early. I canceled my afternoon meetings, packed my briefcase, and drove home, pulling into my narrow driveway just past 11 in the morning. The house was dead silent, exactly as it should be when everyone is supposed to be at work. I unlocked the front door, kicked off my heels in the hallway, and walked toward the kitchen to get a tall glass of ice water. The bright sunlight was streaming through the large historic windows, illuminating the expansive granite island. And right there, sitting dead center on the spotless counter, was a small, heavy-stock paper rectangle. I walked over and picked it up. It was a pristine, white business card with embossed navy blue lettering. It read, Charleston Structural and Foundation Assessments. Underneath was the name of a senior inspector and a direct mobile phone number. I had never called a foundation inspector in my life. There was absolutely nothing wrong with the foundation of my house. I stood there in the quiet kitchen, the small card feeling like a 10-pound lead weight in my trembling hand. The lingering scent of Celeste's signature floral perfume hung faintly in the air, a confident ghost that had just vacated the premises moments before I arrived. In that single, crystalline moment, the heavy veil dropped from my eyes. She was not leaving this card for me to find. She had forgotten it or dropped it in her haste to leave before I caught her. All the uninvited mornings, the rearranged mail, the snooping in my private office, it was never about my choice of candles or the frayed edge of an entryway rug. I was no longer dealing with an overbearing mother-in-law simply trying to assert domestic dominance. Someone was actively measuring, recording, and appraising my property behind my back while I was away at work earning a living. They were preparing to put a calculated price tag on a home that did not belong to them. And as I stared at the embossed letters on that card, I knew with absolute, terrifying certainty that the war for my house had already begun, and I was entirely alone on the battlefield. The invasion did not begin with a battering ram. It began with tissue paper and ribbon. The psychological erosion was a masterclass in plausible deniability. masked by a veneer of Southern hospitality. Celeste initiated her campaign of displacement with objects that were entirely too mundane to start a war over. It started on a Tuesday evening when I came home to find a neat stack of stiff, white linen kitchen towels resting by the sink. Attached was a small note in her elegant cursive, claiming she saw them at a boutique on King Street and simply knew they would brighten up the dark marble countertops. A few days later, it was a heavy cardboard box filled with identical, airtight glass jars. She had taken it upon herself to transfer my flour, sugar, and dried pasta into them, leaving a sticky note explaining that a systemized pantry was the foundation of a peaceful mind. By the end of the month, a laminated sheet of paper appeared on the side of the refrigerator. It was a typed, alphabetized directory of plumbers, electricians, and roofers, complete with emergency after-hours contact numbers. I tried to view these gestures through the lens of a weary daughter-in-law trying to be gracious. I thanked her. I put the towels in a drawer. I left the jars alone. But the nature of her visit soon shifted. She stopped bringing things into my home and started replacing what was already there. The shift was subtle at first. The hand-poured, smoked cedar candles I loved so much vanished from the mantelpiece, replaced by overpowering floral diffusers that gave me a severe headache. I brushed it off, assuming I had absent-mindedly moved them. Then, the antique brass picture frame holding a cherished photograph of my late family was rotated toward the wall, swapped out for a stark, modern silver frame holding a picture of Grant and his brother from their college days. The breaking point for my patience occurred when I walked into the living room and found the heavy, knitted throw blanket on the sofa folded entirely differently. I always draped it casually over the armrest. Now, it was folded into a rigid, perfect square, tucked beneath the cushions with military precision. It was the Mercer standard, a physical manifestation of her control over my resting spaces. I decided to set a hard boundary. The next time she let herself in while I was working from home on a Friday afternoon, I met her in the hallway. I kept my voice steady, my posture straight, determined not to let my frustration bleed into my tone. "Celeste, I appreciate your intentions," I said, looking her directly in the eyes. "But I really need you to stop coming into the house when I'm not here, or when I am busy working. This is my private space, and I need to know it remains private." She did not flinch. She did not apologize. Instead, she offered a soft, dismissive laugh, reaching out to pat my forearm with a hand that felt as cold as winter ice. "Oh, Parker, darling," she cooed, her tone dripping with mock affection. "There is no need to be so formal. We are family. Family does not need to stand on ceremony. I am only trying to lift some of the burden off your shoulders. You work those terribly long hours." She glided past me into the kitchen, entirely unbothered, leaving my boundary shattered on the historic hardwood floor. When I brought the incident to Grant that evening, hoping for a united front, I hit a solid wall of practiced deflection. He was standing by the kitchen island, loosening his tie after a 14-hour shift managing the chaotic rollout of his new seafood restaurant downtown. "She is just trying to help you out, Parker," he sighed, pouring himself a generous measure of bourbon. "You know she means well. She is used to taking care of everything for everyone. It is just how she shows love. She changed my picture frames. Grant. She is reorganizing my pantry. She walks in here like she holds the deed," I countered, my voice rising just a fraction. He rubbed his temples, a gesture designed to show me exactly how exhausting my complaints were to him. "You are too stressed out from your contracts. You are reading way too much into little things. It is just a blanket. It is just a candle. Can we please not turn a simple visit into a federal case? I have had a brutal day." Every time I tried to voice my discomfort, the script remained identical. I was told I was too sensitive. I was told I was overreacting. The conversations were expertly steered away from Celeste's blatant overreach and redirected toward my alleged emotional instability. It was a classic, suffocating gaslighting tactic, and Grant executed it flawlessly, slowly. The chilling reality of the situation washed over me. Celeste did not just want the convenience of dropping by whenever she pleased. She was methodically establishing an unspoken, ironclad rule every boundary, every locked door, every personal preference inside this townhouse was negotiable, provided a Mercer decided it was. She was conditioning me to accept my own erasure within my own walls. The true depth of their entitlement was laid bare during a suffocating family dinner roughly 3 weeks later. We were hosting Grant's family in my formal dining room. The mahogany table was set for 6. The silver was polished. The wine was breathing, and the atmosphere was thick with the kind of polite, superficial chatter that wealthy Southern families use to mask their deep dysfunction. Celeste sat at the opposite end of the table, holding court. She had spent the first 45 minutes of the meal subtly criticizing the seasoning of the roast and the temperature of the soup. I sat quietly, sipping my water, choosing to disengage rather than fight a losing battle in front of a biased audience. Then, the conversation shifted to real estate. Grant was talking about the skyrocketing property taxes in the district, complaining about the overhead costs of his current business ventures. Celeste seized the opening with the terrifying precision of a striking snake. She placed her wine glass down, dabbing the corners of her mouth with a linen napkin. She looked around the room, her eyes sweeping over the crown molding, the original fireplace, and finally, resting coldly and directly on me. "It truly is a magnificent piece of architecture," Celeste announced, her voice carrying effortlessly over the low hum of the dining room. "This house is a wonderful asset. It would be an absolute goldmine if it were managed by someone with a more stable and practical mind." The table fell utterly silent. The words hung in the air, a blatant insult wrapped in the thin guise of an objective financial observation. She had just publicly declared me unfit to manage my own property. I waited for the polite laughter to fade. I waited for my husband to interject, to defend me, to remind his mother that the house she was sitting in belonged solely to the woman he had married. But Grant said absolutely nothing. He kept his eyes fixed on his porcelain plate, cutting a piece of meat with deliberate, agonizingly slow precision. His silence was not just cowardly, it was fully complicit. It was in that heavy silence that my gaze flicked to Wesley, Grant's younger brother, the moment Celeste made her brazen comment. Wesley's head snapped up. His eyes darted toward his mother, a sudden flash of something desperate and calculating crossing his face, before he quickly looked down, gripping the fragile stem of his wineglass so tightly I thought it might shatter in his hand. That tiny, unguarded physical reaction was a massive revelation. A cold spike of clarity drove itself straight through my chest, freezing the blood in my veins. They were not just judging my housekeeping skills. They were not merely criticizing my taste in interior design. The uninvited visits, the boundary pushing, the quiet dismissal of my authority, and now this public devaluation of my competence, none of it was random or accidental. As I sat at the head of my own table, surrounded by people who were eating my food and drinking my wine, the last remnants of my naive goodwill evaporated. This was no longer an annoying family dynamic to be managed. It was a systematic ritual of occupation. They were looking at my sanctuary and seeing nothing but a highly profitable balance sheet, and they were already actively calculating exactly how to cash it in. The air inside my townhouse began to feel distinctly heavier, charged with a quiet, menacing electricity that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I was no longer dealing with simple boundary issues or passive-aggressive critiques regarding my interior decorating. The sanctuary of my home was actively being breached, and the intruder was leaving a trail of very specific, highly alarming breadcrumbs that pointed toward a much larger catastrophe. It started with the mail. I have a precise and rigid system for handling my correspondence, a habit developed from years of managing massive, multi-million-dollar municipal contracts. Incoming mail goes into a brass tray in the foyer. Bills and official financial documents are opened, sorted, and filed strictly on Sunday mornings. One Wednesday evening, I returned from work and noticed my annual home insurance renewal letter was missing from the brass tray. I found it 30 minutes later, sitting haphazardly on the corner of the kitchen island next to a bowl of fruit. It was completely out of place. A few days after that incident, a thick manila envelope containing my quarterly property tax assessment arrived in the mail. When I picked it up to review it, the adhesive flap yielded far too easily. The paper fibers along the edge were slightly torn and warped, indicating clearly that someone had carefully peeled the envelope open, examined the contents, and pressed it back down before I ever laid eyes on it. The paranoia began to gnaw at the edges of my sanity. I tried to convince myself that I was simply being forgetful, that the extreme stress of my corporate job was finally causing my meticulous domestic habits to slip. But the undeniable evidence left in my home office obliterated any remaining doubts I harbored. I walked into the room one night to retrieve a legal pad and glanced at the bottom drawer of my heavy oak filing cabinet. I pulled it open and immediately froze in my tracks. The thick green folder containing the comprehensive invoices, permits, and warranties for the roof renovation I had completed the previous year was entirely out of alphabetical order. It was wedged clumsily between two unrelated utility files, the metal clasp snagging awkwardly on the adjacent paper. It looked exactly like a file that someone had pulled out in a tremendous, panicked rush, photographed or copied, and shoved back in without the necessary care required to hide their tracks. The creeping dread I felt solidified into a concrete, terrifying reality on a bright Friday afternoon. I was sitting at my desk in my glass-walled office at North Hollow, reviewing a complex highway expansion contract, when my phone vibrated loudly against the wood. It was a text message from Mrs. Gable, my elderly neighbor who spends the majority of her days tending to her immaculate rose bushes right next door. "Hello, Parker," the message read. "Are you and Grant planning on selling the townhouse? I just saw a very nice gentleman measuring your front porch and taking several photographs of the brickwork with Celeste out in the yard." My stomach plummeted instantly. The blood roared in my ears so loudly I could barely hear the hum of the office air conditioning. I picked up my phone, my hands shaking slightly, and dialed my husband's number. Grant answered on the second ring, sounding entirely too cheerful and relaxed for a man managing a chaotic restaurant business. "Hey," Grant said smoothly. "What is going on?" "Grant, Mrs. Gable just texted me," I said, keeping my voice dangerously low so my colleagues in the adjacent offices would not hear. "She said your mother is outside our house right now with a man who is measuring the property and taking pictures. Do you know anything about this?" There was absolutely no pause on his end of the line. He did not ask for clarification. He did not sound surprised, confused, or angry that a stranger was documenting our home. His response was instantaneous, delivered with a smooth, practiced ease that made the blood run freezing cold in my veins. "Oh, babe, do not worry about that at all," Grant replied quickly. "She is probably just asking a friend for some fun advice. You know how obsessed she is with historic architecture and real estate. She loves getting professional opinions on old buildings." "It means absolutely nothing," he answered entirely too fast. He sounded exactly like a man who had anticipated the question for hours and had a script ready to deploy the second I asked. A normal husband hearing that his mother was secretly measuring his wife's property would be shocked. Grant was merely managing my reaction, trying to pacify me before I could ask any further questions. "Right," I said, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. "Just for fun. I have to go back to work now." I hung up the phone and immediately opened the security application on my mobile device. When I first inherited the house, the front door came equipped with a basic, slightly outdated doorbell camera. I rarely checked it, preferring to trust the safety of the neighborhood. But now I scrolled frantically back through the cloud storage, searching for the footage from earlier that afternoon. At exactly 1 o'clock, the camera triggered. The silent video fed onto my screen. There was Celeste, wearing a tailored navy dress, standing right on my front porch. Beside her was a tall man in a gray polo shirt. He was not admiring the historic architecture. He was holding a digital laser measuring tool, a thick stack of paper folders, and a metal clipboard. Celeste smiled warmly at him, reached into her designer handbag, pulled out her shiny brass copy of my house key, and unlocked my front door. She swung it open wide and gestured for the man to step inside my home. The camera recorded them entering, and they did not emerge back onto the porch for another 45 minutes. I did not go back to my contracts. I packed my briefcase, left the office, and drove straight home. When I arrived, the house was empty, the air still and silent, holding the ghosts of their trespassing. I waited until Saturday morning to confront her. I knew she would come over, pretending everything was perfectly normal. She let herself in around 10 o'clock, carrying a white bakery box filled with gourmet pastries. I was waiting for her in the kitchen, sitting perfectly still at the granite island. "Good morning, Parker," Celeste chimed, setting the box down gracefully. "I brought those almond croissants you like so much." "Who was the man you brought into my house yesterday afternoon?" "Celeste," I asked. I did not raise my voice. I did not blink. I kept my gaze locked entirely on her face. Celeste paused for a fraction of a second, her hand hovering over the pastry box, before her lips curved into a practiced, serene smile. "Oh, you mean Arthur," she said breezily, waving an elegant hand in the air to dismiss the accusation. "He is just an old acquaintance from the real estate industry. I asked him to drop by and give me some free advice. I am just so worried that this beautiful old house is deteriorating, and I know you simply do not have the time to handle the upkeep with your demanding job. I wanted a professional to take a quick look." "A quick look," I repeated flatly, my tone like crushed ice. "If he was just giving you free advice about the exterior deterioration, why did your free advice require him to spend 45 minutes walking through my formal dining room, my private home office, and my enclosed backyard?" Celeste did not answer the question. She merely looked at me with a soft, patronizing expression, the exact kind of look an indulgent adult gives a toddler who is throwing a tantrum over something they are too young to understand. She smiled, picked up a croissant, and took a delicate bite, completely dismissing my outrage as if it were a minor, amusing character flaw. That night, long after Grant had fallen into a deep, oblivious sleep beside me, I slipped out of bed and walked silently down the hall to my office. I sat in the dark, the harsh glow of my phone illuminating my face. I opened my text message history with Celeste and began scrolling backward, reading every single message she had sent me over the past 6 months. Divorced from the daily context, removed from her sweet southern tone. The words on the screen painted a horrifyingly clear picture. I started noting the specific phrases she used repeatedly in passing conversations. "We really need to think about preserving family assets for the future. It is always wise to consider putting individual assets into a much safer, collective structure. Smart families do not let silly emotional attachments dictate their financial paperwork. Piece by piece, the fragmented evidence locked together to form a terrifying reality. The misplaced insurance documents, the deliberately opened property tax envelope, the snooping in the file cabinet for my roof warranties, the man with the laser measure and the clipboard." Celeste Mercer was not wandering around my house out of simple boredom or an annoying desire to organize my pantry. She was actively building a comprehensive financial dossier. She was measuring the exact square footage, noting the condition of the roof, verifying the property taxes, and calculating the exact, current market value of my home. She was testing the waters, mapping out the legal and financial pathways for a massive transaction. The house was no longer just a building she liked to criticize. It was a highly valuable asset she was actively preparing to acquire. The revelation did not come from a dramatic confession or a misplaced legal document. It came slipping through the wooden slats of my own back porch on a thick, humid Sunday evening. We were hosting a casual family barbecue, an event I had agreed to in a futile attempt to maintain some semblance of domestic normalcy and prove that I was still the gracious hostess they expected me to be. The air was heavy with the smell of charred hickory wood and roasted bell peppers. I had stepped away from the patio and into the dimly lit mudroom to grab a stack of clean linen napkins when the low, frantic cadence of a hushed argument caught my immediate attention. The voice belonged to Wesley. He was standing just outside the screened window, his back pressed hard against the exterior brick wall. a heavy glass of bourbon sweating profusely in his tight grip. His mobile phone was pressed so hard against his ear that the plastic case looked as though it might snap. "You cannot call it a default yet," Wesley hissed into the receiver, his voice trembling with a cocktail of rage and absolute panic. "We agreed to a 60-day extension. I just need 60 more days to restructure the debt and get the summer revenue on the books." He paused, listening to whoever was on the other end of the line, his shoulders hunching defensively. "I know exactly what a balloon payment means. Do not talk to me like I am an idiot. We have the capital lined up. Just hold off the legal notice. And whatever you do not send the paper trail to the house, and absolutely do not tell Parker." My hand froze completely on the stack of white linen napkins. The ambient noise of the crickets and the distant, polite chatter from the garden completely faded away into a dull, white noise. I am a director of contracts. I spend 50 hours every single week swimming in a deep sea of corporate liability, financial clauses, and structured debt. When I hear the phrases balloon payment and default in the same breath, my brain automatically translates them into impending financial ruin. And when my own name is explicitly attached to a demand for strict secrecy regarding that ruin, the threat is no longer a distant, abstract concept. It is standing right on my back porch. Wesley owned a boutique craft brewery over in Mount Pleasant. When he opened the business 2 years ago, the entire Mercer family treated him like a visionary entrepreneur destined for massive wealth. But blind ambition is an incredibly dangerous thing when it is not strictly tethered to financial reality. He had expanded his operations far too aggressively, opening a second tasting room and purchasing massive, custom-built fermentation tanks before his very first location had even broken even. I had seen the subtle warning signs in his manic energy and his constant, desperate need to project immense success at every family dinner. But I had stayed entirely out of it. It was not my business. Or rather, I had foolishly thought it was not my business. To Celeste Mercer, the concept of a failing son was simply an unacceptable reality. In her aristocratic, deeply skewed worldview, a Mercer man did not go bankrupt due to poor business management or reckless expansion. They merely experienced a temporary phase of low liquidity. And in her mind, the absolute only solution to this temporary phase was family intervention. But family, in the Mercer lexicon, did not mean offering moral support or helping Wesley draft a realistic, structured bankruptcy filing. It meant consolidating every available resource to plug the holes in a rapidly sinking ship. It meant that the financial boundaries between her sons and their spouses were completely porous. It meant that other people's privately owned assets were perfectly acceptable life rafts. I waited patiently until the very last guest had driven away, and the dishwasher was humming quietly in the kitchen before I finally confronted my husband. Grant was wiping down the granite island, looking entirely too relaxed for a man whose younger brother was secretly begging creditors for mercy on our patio just 2 hours prior. "I overheard Wesley on the phone tonight," I said, leaning against the wooden door frame, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of any accusatory spikes. "He is defaulting on a balloon payment. His brewery is going under." Grant stopped wiping the counter instantly. The wet sponge hovered mid-air for a fraction of a second before he resumed his cleaning, his movements suddenly rigid and highly calculated. "You should not eavesdrop. Parker, it is just normal business stress. Wesley is dealing with some cash flow issues. The craft beer market is extremely oversaturated right now. A balloon payment is not a simple cash flow issue." "Grant," I corrected him, stepping further into the bright kitchen. "It is a massive, lump sum debt obligation that he clearly cannot cover. Exactly how bad is the situation?" Grant let out a long, heavy sigh, discarding the sponge heavily into the stainless steel sink. He leaned back against the counter, crossing his arms over his chest in a classic defensive posture. "It is rough, okay? He expanded way too quickly. But he is handling it. We are looking at securing a short-term bridge loan to get him through the next 2 business quarters. It is really nothing you need to worry your head about." I stared directly at him. The disparate pieces of the puzzle I had been collecting over the past month The misplaced property tax envelopes, the foundation inspector, the laser measurements suddenly slammed together with terrifying, undeniable clarity. It was never about Celeste wanting to redecorate my living room. It was never about her trying to be a helpful, albeit overbearing, mother-in-law. It was entirely about equity, a short-term bridge loan. I repeated slowly, letting the crisp syllables hang heavily in the air between us. And what exact collateral is Wesley planning to use to secure this bridge loan? Because a failing craft brewery with defaulted debt is not going to underwrite a loan of that massive magnitude. Grant shifted his weight uncomfortably from one foot to the other. He looked away, his eyes darting nervously toward the dark kitchen window. He has options. We are looking at several different avenues. Like I said, Wesley is stressed out of his mind. He is barely sleeping at night. I am just trying to be a supportive brother during a tough time. Grant, look at me, I demanded, my voice hardening into the cold. Authoritative tone I usually reserved for hostile corporate negotiations. Is anyone in your family thinking about using my townhouse as collateral for Wesley's business debt? The silence that immediately followed was the absolute loudest sound I had ever heard in my entire life. Grant did not loudly deny the accusation. He did not act shocked or deeply offended by the suggestion. He did not immediately step forward to assure me that my inherited property was completely safe from his brother's failures. Instead, he deflected. "Parker, you are being incredibly unfair right now," Grant said, his tone shifting smoothly into wounded indignation. "My brother is on the verge of losing absolutely everything he has worked for over the last 2 years, and you are immediately jumping to selfish, paranoid conclusions. We are just trying to survive a major financial crisis. Can we please have some basic compassion here?" He did not answer the question, and in his cowardly refusal to answer, he told me absolutely everything I needed to know. The hardwood floor beneath my feet felt as though it were made of thin ice, cracking rapidly in every conceivable direction. The most terrifying realization of the night was not that Celeste Mercer was a greedy, manipulative woman who wanted to steal my home to save her favored son. The true, suffocating horror was looking at the man I married and realizing that he was entirely complicit. Grant had likely known about Wesley's impending bankruptcy for many months. He had known exactly why his mother was constantly coming into my house while I was at the office. He had stood silently by and watched her measure my dining room, photograph my roof, and sift through my private financial records. And he had done absolutely nothing to stop her. He had played the comfortable role of the exhausted, neutral middleman while secretly holding the front door wide open for the invading army. At exactly 11 o'clock that night, my phone chimed softly from the wooden nightstand. I picked it up. It was a lengthy text message from Celeste. The block of text was meticulously formatted, grammatically perfect, and completely devoid of any genuine human warmth. "Dearest Parker," the message began, "I just wanted to thank you for hosting such a lovely evening. Seeing the family together always reminds me of the supreme importance of unity in these turbulent economic times. I truly believe we must look at the bigger picture. There is an immense benefit to converting individual assets into properly managed family assets. A unified estate offers security and financial leverage that scattered, standalone properties simply cannot provide. We should all sit down very soon and discuss how to structure our collective resources safely. Sleep well." I sat perfectly still in the dark bedroom, the harsh, artificial light from the phone screen washing over my face. I read the message 3 times. Underneath the polite phrasing and the sophisticated vocabulary of a seasoned estate planner, the underlying threat was violently clear. My townhouse was no longer viewed as my private inheritance. In the collective, entitled mind of the Mercer family, it was a stray, untapped resource that urgently needed to be corralled, legally absorbed, and ultimately liquidated to pay for their spectacular mistakes. The fragile illusion of my marriage dissolved completely in that single instant. This was no longer a petty domestic dispute about an overbearing mother-in-law rearranging my pantry jars or criticizing my choice of candles. This was a high-stakes, meticulously planned financial siege. It was a brutal tug of war over legal ownership, blind loyalty, and the core definition of our marriage. They truly believed I was soft enough to be bullied and naive enough to simply sign away my aunt's legacy in the sacred name of familial duty. But they had fundamentally misunderstood exactly who lived in this house. The era of the accommodating, silent daughter-in-law was officially dead, and the director of contracts was finally awake. The invitation came disguised as an olive branch. On a Tuesday afternoon, Celeste called and suggested we host a Sunday brunch at the townhouse. She framed it as an opportunity for the entire family to sit down and discuss our collective financial futures in a civilized, mature manner. On the surface, it sounded like a peace offering, a chance to clear the stifling air that had settled over us since the barbecue incident. In reality, it was a meticulously constructed snare, designed to corner me in my own dining room. I spent 2 entire days preparing the house. I was determined to strip her of any ammunition. I hired a professional crew to deep clean the hardwood floors until they gleamed like dark glass. I polished the antique silver flatware until my fingers ached. I ordered fresh white orchids from a florist on King Street and arranged them flawlessly as the centerpiece. I baked a quiche from scratch and prepared a delicate lemon tart for dessert. I wanted the environment to be so impeccably perfect that Celeste would choke on her own critiques. I needed to maintain my dignity and prove, visually and undeniably, that I was in absolute command of my domain. Celeste arrived at 10:30 in the morning, a full 30 minutes before the rest of the guests were scheduled to appear. She wore a tailored cream suit that looked entirely too formal for a Sunday brunch. The moment she stepped into the foyer, her demeanor shifted from a polite guest to a listing agent evaluating a high-end property. She did not immediately greet me or offer to help in the kitchen. Instead, she took a slow, deliberate walk through the ground floor. I watched from the kitchen doorway as she glided into the living room, her eyes scanning the crown molding, tracing the lines of the baseboards, and lingering on the original fireplace mantel. She was cataloging the inventory. By noon, the dining table was full. Grant sat at the opposite end. Wesley was there, alongside his wife, Meredith, who barely made eye contact with me. The meal proceeded with an agonizing layer of fake Southern charm. We discussed the pleasant spring weather, the recent influx of tourists to the historic district, and a new gallery opening downtown. It was a suffocating theater of manners. The charade ended the exact moment I served the lemon tart and poured the dark roast coffee. Celeste delicately wiped her mouth with a linen napkin, placed it neatly beside her porcelain plate, and reached down into her structured leather handbag. The dining room fell completely silent. The clinking of silver forks against china ceased. She produced a thick stack of glossy, high-resolution color photographs and placed them face down on the polished mahogany table. "Parker, darling," Celeste began, her voice dripping with an artificial, syrupy concern that made my skin crawl. "We all know how incredibly hard you work at your corporate job. The hours you put in are simply staggering. And because we love you, we have all been growing increasingly worried about the enormous toll this historic property is taking on you." She reached out and slowly turned the first 3 photographs face up, sliding them toward the center of the table for everyone to see. The first picture was a zoomed-in shot of a faint, yellowish water stain on the ceiling of the guest bedroom, a remnant from a heavy rainstorm the previous month that I had already scheduled a contractor to repair. The second photograph showed my leather armchair in the home office, temporarily cluttered with 3 thick manila folders containing construction permits. The third image was taken inside my backyard storage shed, displaying a stack of half-empty paint cans and a rolled-up drop cloth I had not yet thrown away. She had taken these pictures secretly during her uninvited incursions. She was weaponizing my mundane domestic chores. "You see," Celeste continued, her tone shifting into a gentle, patronizing reprimand, "maintaining a property of this magnitude is a full-time job in itself. It is abundantly clear that you are overwhelmed. You are holding on to a massive asset that is simply beyond your current capacity to manage alone. It is nothing to be ashamed of. Darling, but we cannot let this beautiful home fall into disrepair." I sat perfectly rigid in my chair, The air in my lungs felt heavy and hot. I did not look at the photographs. I kept my gaze locked directly on her face. "Therefore," Celeste said, pulling a sleek navy blue leather folder from her bag and placing it decisively on top of the photographs. "I took the liberty of consulting with our family attorneys. They agree that a joint ownership structure would be infinitely safer and more beneficial for everyone involved. It will relieve you of this crushing burden and ensure the property is protected." She flipped the heavy cover of the folder open. Printed across the top of the pristine white legal document, in bold, black letters, were the words, "Mercer Family Preservation Limited Liability Company." She pushed the document across the polished wood until it stopped inches from my coffee cup. It was a fully drafted legal agreement, an intricate mechanism designed to absorb my private inheritance into a corporate entity controlled entirely by her and her sons. She was presenting it not as a drastic, life-altering request, but as a finalized solution to a problem she had completely fabricated. All she needed was my signature to play the role of the compliant, agreeable woman who was grateful to be rescued from her own supposed incompetence. I turned my head slowly and looked at Grant. I expected him to act surprised. I expected him to intervene, to express outrage that his mother had secretly photographed our guest room ceiling and drawn up corporate transfer papers behind our backs. Grant cleared his throat nervously, avoiding my eyes. He looked down at his half-eaten dessert. "Parker," he said softly, his voice lacking any spine or conviction. "Maybe we should just at least hear out the proposal. Mother has a point about the upkeep costs. It would take a lot of pressure off your shoulders if we pooled our resources." That single sentence froze the blood in my veins. Grant was not caught off guard. He had not been ambushed. He knew exactly what was inside that navy blue folder before she even placed it on the table. This was not a sudden, impulsive overreach by a controlling mother. This was a highly coordinated, premeditated ambush, and my husband was a willing co-conspirator. In that specific moment, a lesser woman might have exploded. She might have screamed, thrown the glossy photographs across the room, or burst into tears of profound betrayal. She might have ordered them all to get out of her house. I did none of those things. I stayed still, kept my expression neutral, and watched every person at that table reveal exactly where they stood. I looked around my beautiful dining room, and I memorized the exact layout of the battlefield. I noted how Wesley was holding his breath, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table, desperate for this transfer of wealth to save his sinking brewery. I noted how Meredith kept her eyes fixed firmly on her lap, perfectly aware of the ambush but too cowardly to warn me. I noted the faint, triumphant smirk playing at the very corners of Celeste's mouth, and I memorized the exact angle of Grant's bowed head, the ultimate portrait of a man selling out his wife to cover his family's debts. The burning humiliation I felt in my chest instantly transmuted into something entirely different. It turned into pure, crystalline strategy, right there, amidst the scent of lemon tart and dark coffee. I made a silent, irreversible vow. I was completely done trying to defend my emotional boundaries. I was done arguing with them about whether I was being treated poorly or if they were overstepping their bounds. Debating feelings with predators is a spectacular waste of time. From this exact second forward, I would no longer act like a wounded spouse. I would act like the director of contracts. I would stop trying to change their minds and start focusing exclusively on the concrete evidence. I would document every single thing they did. I would record every single word they said. I would track every document they drafted and every signature they attempted to coerce. They thought they had trapped a soft, emotional woman in a corner, hoping she would eventually sign away her kingdom just to keep the peace. They were about to learn that they had handed a paper trail to a woman who knew exactly how to use one. "I will certainly read over the proposal, Celeste," I said evenly, offering her a cool, entirely vacant smile. "Thank you for bringing it to my attention." I reached out, pulled the navy blue folder toward me, and placed my hand firmly flat on top of it. From that moment on, I stopped thinking like a wife trying to keep the peace and started thinking like a woman building a case. Monday morning arrived with a heavy gray overcast that matched the suffocating atmosphere inside my townhouse. Grant left the house at 7 o'clock, muttering something about an early vendor meeting for his new restaurant location. I did not ask him for details. I did not bring up the disastrous brunch from the day before. Nor did I mention the navy blue folder containing the Mercer family preservation legal documents still sitting untouched on my desk. I simply drank my black coffee, watched him walk out the front door, and then picked up my phone. I was no longer interested in playing the role of a wounded wife desperately demanding an explanation. Explanations were for people who still believed their relationship could be salvaged. I needed a tactical battle plan. By 10 o'clock that morning, I was sitting in a minimalist, glass-walled conference room on Broad Street, looking across a polished mahogany table at Evelyn Cross. Evelyn was an independent real estate attorney who specialized in the brutal, surgical extraction of separate assets before and during contentious marriages. She did not deal in feelings or family harmony. She dealt exclusively in ironclad paper trails. "The deed is entirely in your name, Parker," Evelyn said, adjusting her silver-rimmed glasses as she reviewed the thick stack of documents I had brought her. "As it stands right this second, that townhouse is your separate property. Your aunt left it to you, and because you never added Grant to the title after the wedding, it is legally protected. However, the protection is not completely bulletproof if you start acting carelessly." "Define carelessly," I told her, my voice perfectly level. "If you sign that family preservation document Celeste handed you, you surrender your sole ownership instantly," Evelyn explained, leaning forward and folding her hands on the table. "But even without your signature on that specific corporate transfer, they could try to establish a pattern of joint management. If Grant starts paying the property taxes from his business account, or if he directly pays a contractor for a major renovation, they can legally argue commingling of assets. They can claim he has a vested financial interest in the property's overall appreciation. You must keep every single expense related to that house completely isolated in an account that only bears your name." I nodded slowly, absorbing the tactical advice. I then told Evelyn about the man with the laser measure and the clipboard whom Celeste had led into my home. I asked her if there was any way to find out what they were actually doing with those measurements. Evelyn made a few discreet phone calls to colleagues in the local commercial lending sector. Less than an hour later, she had an answer that chilled me straight to the bone. A formal request for a property valuation was submitted to a regional financial firm last Thursday. Evelyn revealed, her expression turning incredibly grim. "The firm is currently reviewing it for a massive commercial credit line extension. The terrifying part is the raw data they submitted. The application included the exact interior square footage, the remaining lifespan of your heating system, and the precise monetary cost of the roof replacement you completed last year." They had used the documents Celeste had stolen from my filing cabinet. They had lifted the exact numbers from my private records to prop up Wesley's failing brewery. I left Evelyn's office at noon and drove back to North Hollow Infrastructure. I sat at my desk, staring blindly at my computer monitor, when my private cell phone vibrated violently against the wood. The caller identification displayed the name Meredith Shaw, Wesley's wife. I answered on the first ring. "Hello, Meredith." "Parker," Meredith whispered, her voice tight and anxious, accompanied by the distinct sound of a hollow door clicking shut and locking in the background. "I only have a few minutes before Wesley gets back from the warehouse. I had to call you. I could not sleep at all last night after that awful brunch. I feel physically sick about what they are doing to you." "Tell me exactly what they are doing, Meredith," I said, skipping all the polite southern pleasantries we usually exchanged. Meredith let out a long, shaky breath. "Celeste has been planning this for several months. She told Wesley that she is arranging what she calls a paper-signing dinner. She wants to corner you in front of a public notary and a family lawyer to get you to sign the townhouse over to the corporate entity. She thinks she can use the equity in your house to secure a massive loan and save the brewery before it completely defaults." "And Grant?" I asked, my grip tightening on the phone. "What is Grant's exact role in all of this?" Meredith hesitated, and when she finally spoke, her words were a surgical strike straight into the center of my chest. "Celeste told Wesley not to worry about Grant. She bragged about it just 2 weeks ago. She said Grant specifically chose you because you are incredibly soft. She said you are gentle. You absolutely hate conflict, and you bend over backward to keep everyone in the family happy. She promised Wesley that if they apply enough psychological pressure in a polite, family setting, you will eventually just sign the papers to keep the peace. She genuinely thinks you're completely spineless. A profound, icy silence stretched across the cellular line. I did not cry. I did not gasp in shock. I just felt a cold, hard knot of pure resolve solidify in the very center of my chest. "Thank you for telling me, Meredith," I said quietly. "Do not let them know we spoke today." I ended the call and went back to my spreadsheets. But I was no longer looking at municipal highway contracts. I was building an entirely different kind of matrix. That evening, Grant sent me a brief text message claiming he was working late at the restaurant and would not be home until past midnight. It was the absolute perfect opportunity. I locked the front door, marched upstairs to my home office, and opened my personal laptop. I pulled up the entire digital history of the archaic doorbell camera, dating back over the last 6 months. I opened a blank spreadsheet. In the very first column, I entered the exact date and time of every single instance Celeste appeared on the camera footage. In the second column, I cross-referenced my own daily schedule, pulling data directly from my corporate work calendar. In the third column, I noted the days I found my incoming mail disturbed, the days objects were shifted in my office, and the exact day she brought the appraiser. In the final column, I logged Grant's behavior, tracking the days he was unusually evasive, the days he picked an argument out of nowhere, or the days he conveniently vanished for extended hours. As I systematically populated the rows, the scattered puzzle pieces formed a devastatingly clear, undeniable picture. Celeste never dropped by my house randomly. Every single entry occurred exactly when my calendar showed I was locked in mandatory executive meetings or conducting off-site visits. She was actively tracking my schedule, and she was not doing it alone. The days she spent the longest amount of time inside my house perfectly aligned with the days Grant claimed his phone battery died or he was stuck in a dead zone at a new construction site. Grant was acting as her lookout. Grant was intentionally feeding her my schedule. Every new data point I entered into that spreadsheet was another heavy nail in the coffin of my marriage. For years, I had made endless excuses for him. I had told myself that Grant was just a passive man, a victim of an overbearing mother, simply too weak to stand up to her overwhelming personality. But the timeline proved that was an absolute lie. Grant was not a victim. He was the inside man. He was actively benefiting from my vulnerability, willingly sacrificing my personal sanctuary and my inheritance to cover his family's catastrophic financial disasters. He had sold me out for a commercial bridge loan. The pain of that realization was staggering. It felt as if something inside me had collapsed all at once. I sat in the dark office, staring at the glowing screen, silently acknowledging the permanent death of the life I thought I had built. But instead of bursting into tears, instead of packing a suitcase and screaming at him when he finally walked through the door hours later, I made a vastly different choice. I chose a calmness that bordered on the absolutely terrifying. If they wanted a soft, agreeable woman who avoided conflict at all costs, I would give them exactly what they wanted. I would smile brightly. I would make pleasant conversation over dinner. I would let them continue to believe that their psychological warfare was working perfectly. I would let Celeste think she was the grand architect of my imminent defeat. And I would let Grant believe he was successfully managing his fragile, clueless wife. I would let them dig the hole as deep as they possibly could, because I needed them entirely off guard for what I was preparing to do next. The time for arguing was over. Ever since that moment, I focused on recording every detail to responsibly conclude the matter. My residence had long served as a personal retreat, but it suddenly demanded strict protection. I took a personal day off from North Hollow infrastructure on a Tuesday, waiting until I was absolutely certain Grant was tied up at a day-long vendor tasting. The moment his car turned the corner, the contractors arrived. First, the locks. I had a security technician install a state-of-the-art smart lock system on every exterior door. However, I explicitly instructed the technician to install a transitional cylinder on the front door. Visually, it looked identical to the antique brass deadbolt Celeste had a copy for. If a person inserted the old, jagged key, the cylinder would allow it to slide in. But the internal pins would not turn the deadbolt. Instead, the mechanism would immediately send a silent, time-stamped alert directly to my mobile phone, logging the exact moment an unauthorized entry was attempted. The house was now keeping a meticulous diary of its invaders. Next came the eyes. I had the technician mount prominent, highly visible cameras at the main entrance, the top of the back staircase, and high in the corner of the formal dining room. They were obvious deterrents, blinking with small green lights, but the visible cameras were merely decoys. The true surveillance network was entirely invisible. I installed miniature, legally compliant motion-activated lenses disguised as USB chargers and smoke detectors in the narrow hallway upstairs. And most importantly, pointed directly at the heavy oak filing cabinet inside my private home office. The house was no longer a passive structure. It was actively watching back. My final errand of the day required a quick trip to a secure banking facility on Meeting Street. I carried a heavy, waterproof briefcase containing the original deed to the property, the certified copy of my aunt's will, the massive stack of renovation invoices, and my current property tax and insurance policies. I locked all the original documents inside a steel safe deposit box. When I returned home, I placed high-quality, color-printed photocopies of every single document back into the exact same green folders, placing them in the filing cabinet with a single, microscopic piece of clear tape securing the drawer shut. The bait was set perfectly. That evening, I sat on the sofa, poured myself a small glass of red wine, and composed a text message to my mother-in-law. I carefully crafted the tone to sound vulnerable, slightly overwhelmed, and deeply appreciative of her recent interventions. "Hi, Celeste," I typed. "I have been thinking a lot about our conversation at brunch. I wanted to thank you sincerely for caring so much about the house and my stress levels. I'm starting to realize how heavy this burden is. I would love to hear more of your advice on future plans for the property when you have a moment." I hit send and waited. The response arrived exactly 14 minutes later. "Oh, Parker, darling," the message read. "I am so relieved you are finally seeing reason. It takes a mature woman to admit when she needs help. We will absolutely sit down and map out a brilliant strategy. I will come by this week to look at a few more structural details so we have a clear picture before we finalize any paperwork. Rest well." The smug satisfaction radiating from her text was palpable. She genuinely believed she had worn me down, anticipating the glorious day I would obediently sit at the dining table and sign my inheritance away. She took the bait without a single hesitation. The opportunity arrived on a humid Thursday afternoon. I had intentionally worked from home, parking my car 3 blocks away in a public garage so the driveway remained completely empty. I was sitting at my kitchen island with my laptop open when my phone vibrated silently against the granite. A push notification flashed across the screen. An unauthorized physical key had been inserted into the front door lock. 5 seconds later, a second notification appeared. She was trying it again, jiggling the brass, confused as to why her golden pass was suddenly malfunctioning. 10 seconds after the second failed attempt, the front doorbell chimed loudly through the house. I took a deep breath, smoothed my skirt, and walked unhurriedly down the hall. I pulled open the heavy wooden door and offered her a bright, welcoming smile. Celeste stood on the porch, her hand hovering awkwardly near her designer handbag where she had hastily hidden the useless key. She looked momentarily startled, but she recovered with the speed of a seasoned politician. "Parker," she exclaimed, placing a hand over her heart, "I had absolutely no idea you were home. I was just in the neighborhood and thought I would drop by to measure that drafty window frame in the living room." "What a wonderful surprise," I replied, stepping aside to let her in. "Please come inside. I was just making some iced tea." I led her into the living room, ensuring she sat directly in the line of sight of the new decoy camera, which she noticed immediately. Her eyes darted to the blinking light, and she shifted her posture to appear perfectly poised. I handed her a tall glass of tea and sat opposite her, adopting the posture of a willing, exhausted student eager for her guidance. "I have been thinking about what you said regarding the corporate structure," I murmured, keeping my voice soft and deferential. "I just worry about losing the history of the house." Celeste offered a condescending, maternal laugh, leaning forward to pat my knee. "Darling, history is preserved by strong families, not single individuals. You have a profound responsibility to the Mercer name now. It is a common mistake of women holding assets alone to let sentimentality cloud their financial judgment. You are a smart girl, but dealing with commercial equity and familial debt requires a different kind of vision. Sometimes, you just need an older generation to steer the ship." I nodded slowly, absorbing every single word, fighting the overwhelming urge to throw the icy beverage directly into her meticulously powdered face. "I suppose you are right," I whispered. "I just need to review the final papers to understand how it all works." "Of course, dear," she said, her smile widening into a triumphant grin. "We will have the attorneys finalize the language, and then we can have a lovely dinner to celebrate the new arrangement." She stayed for another 20 minutes, lecturing me on property depreciation, before excusing herself. I walked her to the front door, watched her descend the brick steps, and closed the door firmly behind her. That night, while Grant was purportedly managing a crisis at the restaurant, I sat in my darkened office and accessed the secure cloud server. I pulled up the footage from the exterior porch camera. The video showed Celeste exiting my house. She walked down the steps, pulled her mobile phone from her bag, and immediately dialed a number. She stood on the brick pathway, well within the microphone's optimal range, waiting for the person to answer. "Wesley?" Her voice crackled through my computer speakers, sharp and authoritative. "I just left her. It is completely handled. She is terrified of the maintenance costs and completely eager to hand over the reins. Once she signs the corporate transfer, the rest is just restructuring the cash flow to cover your warehouse debts. Call the lending officer and tell him the collateral package will be fully executed by the end of the month." She ended the call, adjusted her sunglasses, and walked away. I closed the laptop screen. The soft click echoed loudly in the quiet room. There were no more shadows, no more doubts, and no more desperate rationalizations about a misunderstanding between a wife and her husband's family. My mother-in-law did not just want to step into my house to organize my pantry or dictate my decor. She wanted to step directly onto my name, erase my ownership, and forge my signature into a financial life raft for her son. The house had watched her confess, and I finally had every single piece of ammunition I needed to burn their entire scheme to the ground. Grant's betrayal finally materialized into a concrete conversation on a humid Wednesday evening. I was sitting at the kitchen island, meticulously reviewing a commercial contract on my laptop, when he walked through the door. He poured himself a glass of red wine, loosened his tie, and leaned against the granite counter. The air between us had been strained for weeks, but tonight, he wore a mask of casual, practiced ease. "I was talking to Mother and Wesley earlier today," Grant began, swirling the dark liquid in his glass. "Wesley is in a really tight spot. If he does not secure an injection of capital by the end of the summer, he is going to lose the warehouse." I kept my eyes fixed on my screen. "I am sorry to hear that, Grant. The thing is," he continued, his tone lightening artificially, "there is a very simple way we can help him without taking on any actual risk. Mother's attorneys have drafted a temporary, short-term holding structure. If we just sign the property over to the family preservation entity for a few months, Wesley can use the collective equity to secure his bridge loan. Once he is clear, the deed transfers right back to you. It is just paper shuffling. Parker, nothing changes for us." He spoke the words with an agonizingly casual cadence. He was asking me to surrender the sole legal claim to my sanctuary, my inheritance, and my financial security. as if he were asking to borrow a folding chair for a weekend barbecue. He spoke of my home as though it were a fluid asset that could be casually tossed into his brother's sinking ship and magically retrieved completely dry a few months later. I forced myself to pause my typing. I looked up at him, injecting a calculated amount of hesitation and weary vulnerability into my expression. "A temporary structure?" I asked softly, letting my shoulders slump. "I do not know. Grant. It sounds incredibly complicated. Are you absolutely sure it would just be for a few months?" Grant exhaled a long, heavy sigh of profound relief. The tension instantly drained from his posture. He genuinely believed he had broken through my final wall of resistance. "I promise you, Parker, it is entirely temporary. It is just to get Wesley through the next 2 business quarters. I can have Mother send over the specific paperwork for you to review if it makes you feel better." "Please do," I murmured, turning my attention back to my laptop. "I just want to see the specific details." He smiled, a wide, genuine expression of victory, and walked out of the kitchen. He had been waiting for this exact moment of surrender for a very long time. The following morning, I had a scheduled half-day off-site meeting at a construction site across town. I left the house at 8 o'clock in the morning. By 10 o'clock, the silent notifications on my phone began to rapidly trigger. Sitting in the back of my firm's town car, I opened the secure application. The smart lock on the front door registered the manual override I had secretly authorized for Celeste's specific digital profile, making her believe her old brass key had magically worked again. The decoy camera in the foyer captured her striding inside, entirely unapologetic, followed immediately by 2 men in sharp business suits. One man carried a heavy leather bank briefcase. The other held a high-powered digital camera and a laser level. For the next hour, I watched through the lenses of my hidden network as the 3 of them violated every inch of my home. The inspector photographed the intricate crown molding in the living room, inspected the electrical panel in the utility closet, and examined the structural integrity of the back staircase. But the most damning footage came from the tiny invisible lens disguised as a USB charger in my home office. Celeste walked straight into the room, abandoning the 2 men downstairs. She went directly to my heavy oak filing cabinet. I watched in cold, high-definition clarity as she pulled open the bottom drawer, bypassing the decoy files, and went straight for the green folder labeled with my insurance policies. She pulled out the thick stack of photocopies I had meticulously planted, laid them flat on my mahogany desk, and spent 12 minutes photographing every single page with her mobile phone. The final devastating blow arrived on Friday afternoon, delivered not by a hidden camera, but by a massive administrative error. I was at my desk at North Hollow Infrastructure when an email appeared in my personal inbox. It was forwarded from a senior commercial loan officer at a regional bank. The loan officer had intended to send a follow-up email directly to Grant, but in a rush of incompetence, he had selected the auto-filled contact group that included my private email address. The subject line read, "Collateral Package Review." I clicked open the attached thread. My lungs stopped expanding. The blood drained completely from my face, leaving my skin cold and clammy. It was a comprehensive, ongoing correspondence between Grant and the lending institution. Attached to the thread was a 20-page document detailing the proposed collateral for Wesley's massive business loan. Sitting at the very top of the asset list was my historic townhouse. The sheer horror was the meticulous paper trail of Grant's active, enthusiastic participation. There were emails from Grant sending the loan officer my exact property tax figures from the previous year. There were attachments containing the specific repair logs I had kept for the roof replacement. There were high-resolution photographs of my living room and exterior brickwork that Grant had clearly taken himself while I was away on business trips. He was not a passive victim being dragged along by his domineering mother. He was the primary architect of the theft. He was the inside informant, eagerly packaging my inheritance and handing it over to the bank. My hands shook so violently that the wireless mouse rattled against my desk. The betrayal was a physical agony, a sharp, twisting blade directly beneath my ribs, just as I was staring at the screen. My phone vibrated. It was Grant. He had clearly realized the loan officer's catastrophic mistake. "Parker," Grant said, his voice tight and breathless the second I answered the phone. "Listen, I just saw that email from the bank. I know exactly how it looks, but I need you to calm down. The loan officer made a mistake. I was strictly exploring options, just running hypothetical numbers to see what a collateral package might look like in a worst-case scenario. I did not authorize them to use the house. It was just a preliminary inquiry." He was lying so fast he was practically tripping over his own words. He was terrified that his premature exposure would ruin the paper-signing dinner they had planned. I closed my eyes, forcing my breathing to slow down to a steady, rhythmic pace. I swallowed the burning acid of my rage. "Okay, Grant," I said, my voice eerily calm. "I understand. Thank you for clarifying. I am very busy with a contract right now, so we can talk about it later." I hung up the phone before he could say another word. I did not confront him. I did not demand further explanations. Instead, I saved the entire email thread, downloaded every single attachment, and encrypted the file. I forwarded the entire package directly to Evelyn Cross and copied a highly aggressive forensic accountant she had recommended. The stage was perfectly set. The trap was fully loaded. The only thing missing was the final trigger, and Celeste Mercer, in her boundless arrogance, happily provided it. On Saturday morning, my phone buzzed with a text message from her. She was confirming the logistics for our upcoming Sunday dinner, the event she believed would mark the successful transfer of my wealth. "Good morning, darling," the text read. "I have all the paperwork ready. Hope this time you will do the practical thing for the family." I stared at the screen, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, surgical precision. I typed my reply, hitting send without a single fraction of hesitation. "I will." Sunday evening arrived wrapped in the heavy, fragrant air of late spring. I spent the entire afternoon preparing the townhouse, moving with the quiet, deliberate grace of an executioner meticulously sharpening a blade. I wanted the space to look exactly like a pristine, beautiful surrender. I ironed the heavy damask tablecloth until it was entirely flawless, spreading it smoothly over the long mahogany dining table. I decanted a vintage Bordeaux precisely at 5 o'clock, letting the dark, heavy wine breathe in a crystal vessel. The lighting in the room was intentionally low and cozy, casting a warm golden hue over the perfectly symmetrical floral arrangements I had ordered from the boutique down the street. Everything in the room was designed to look like a gesture of ultimate, exhausted capitulation. I had extended the dinner invitation exactly as Celeste had orchestrated. I invited everyone she deemed necessary for her grand finale. Grant was there, of course, playing the role of the supportive, neutral husband bridging the gap between his wife and his family. Celeste arrived wearing a triumphant pearl necklace and a tailored dress. Wesley was sweating profusely through his expensive linen shirt, reeking of quiet desperation and his impending bankruptcy. Meredith trailed silently behind him, her eyes firmly fixed on the hardwood floorboards, entirely consumed by her own guilt. Accompanying the family were two men I had never officially met. One was introduced as their longtime family accountant, a man who looked entirely too comfortable handling other people's money and hiding their debts. The other was vaguely introduced as a paperwork consultant. He carried a heavy leather briefcase and wore a cheap, ill-fitting suit. I knew exactly what his true purpose was. He was a public notary, brought into my private home to officially witness and stamp the total transfer of my financial security. I smiled warmly and welcomed them all inside, taking their coats and offering them crystal glasses of sparkling water and wine. However, I had made two additional, highly classified invitations that the Mercer family knew absolutely nothing about. I had coordinated secretly with Evelyn Cross, my ruthless real estate attorney, and a highly specialized independent financial auditor. My instructions to them were incredibly precise. They were not to arrive for the beginning of the dinner. They were instructed to ring the front doorbell exactly 45 minutes after the main course was served. They were to arrive as unexpected drop-in guests, bursting the tightly sealed, polite bubble of the dining room before Celeste or Grant had any opportunity whatsoever to construct a unified defensive lie. In the center of the formal living room, just adjacent to the dining area, I had positioned a large, high-definition flat-screen monitor. It dominated the space, a sleek black rectangle standing in stark contrast against the historic floral wallpaper. When Grant had asked about it earlier that afternoon, I offered a soft, entirely plausible explanation. "I just want to show your mother the new architectural blueprints for the front facade restoration after we eat," I had told him, keeping my voice light and enthusiastic. "You know how much she absolutely loves historic architectural details. I thought it would be a nice bonding moment before we look at any other documents." Grant had bought the excuse immediately, exhaling a massive sigh of relief. He even helped me run the connection cables along the baseboards so no one would trip over them. The cables lay coiled and ready, looking entirely innocent. A technological Trojan horse waiting silently in my living room, while the guests mingled in the parlor, admiring the antique rugs and sipping their drinks. I excused myself to check on the roasted lamb. I stood alone in the kitchen, the heavy wooden door pushed nearly shut. Lined up on the expansive granite island, hidden just out of sight from the dining area, were 5 distinct, perfectly aligned stacks of paper. Stack 1 contained the comprehensive digital logs from my newly installed smart lock system, highlighting every single unauthorized entry attempt with exact dates and timestamps. Stack 2 was the printed, forwarded email thread from the commercial loan officer, detailing Grant's enthusiastic submission of my home for Wesley's collateral package. Stack 3 was a certified, legally binding report from my forensic accountant, proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that every single cent spent on the property's upkeep, taxes, and renovations came exclusively from my separate, individual bank accounts. Stack 4 consisted of formal legal cease and desist letters, drafted beautifully by Evelyn, detailing the criminal trespassing committed by Celeste and her hired appraisers. Finally, sitting slightly apart from the rest of the heavy documentation, was a single, thin white envelope across the front. I had written Grant's name in crisp, elegant black ink. No one in the parlor knew that inside that deceptively light envelope were fully executed legal separation papers, alongside the binding banking mandates, immediately severing his access to all of our joint checking and savings accounts. The tension in the house was incredibly thick, but I amplified it by behaving in a manner that was completely contrary to my usual defensive posture. I was unusually gentle. I laughed softly at Wesley's forced, nervous jokes. I poured Grant a second glass of wine with a loving, reassuring touch to his shoulder. I was so incredibly accommodating that Grant visibly physically relaxed into his chair, the tight lines of worry completely vanishing from his forehead. He genuinely believed his emotional manipulation had worked. He thought I was finally tired enough, broken enough, and desperate enough to choose peace over my own property. Just before I announced that dinner was ready, Celeste drifted through the first floor like she was inspecting a property she already believed belonged to her. I watched from the kitchen doorway. She traced her manicured fingers over the pristine wainscoting in the hallway. She paused to admire the reflection of the crystal chandelier in the polished silver serving trays. The house was immaculate, and it was entirely ready for her. Her smile was incredibly expansive. It was not a smile of familial love or maternal warmth. It was the distinct, radiant smirk of a conqueror surveying a freshly captured territory. She looked around my beautiful home with the absolute, unshakable conviction of a woman who was about to legally claim the keys to the castle without firing a single shot. She thought she had won. She thought the elegant table setting and the expensive wine were tributes to her superior intellect and her unyielding authority over the Mercer family. But as I untied my apron and smoothed the heavy fabric of my dress, I felt absolutely no sorrow. I did not arrange this exquisite evening to salvage a broken marriage. I did not spend hours roasting a lamb to appease a greedy, entitled family who viewed me as nothing more than a convenient, silent bank account. I prepared this dinner as a formal, highly orchestrated ceremony. It was a stage perfectly set for a brutal, undeniable unveiling. I was not there to sign away my future. I was there to execute a flawless reclamation. I was reclaiming my irrefutable evidence, my personal dignity, and my absolute right to dictate exactly who was allowed to stand inside the walls of my home. I took a deep, steadying breath, picked up the first heavy silver serving platter, and walked into the dining room to begin the final act. The moment the plates holding the remnants of the roasted lamb were cleared away, the atmosphere in the formal dining room shifted from tense to strictly transactional. The man introduced earlier as the paperwork consultant cleared his throat loudly and reached down to unlatch his heavy leather briefcase. The sharp, metallic click of the brass latches echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. Celeste sat up perfectly straight at the far end of the mahogany table. She folded her manicured hands delicately over the crisp white tablecloth and looked at me with a sickeningly sweet, entirely manufactured expression of maternal warmth. "Parker, darling," Celeste began, her voice resonating with practiced theatricality. "We all know that true family is about making the right sacrifices at the exact right moment. We must not let personal ego or misguided pride harm the future of everyone sitting at this table. Signing these transfer documents today is the absolute most mature, practical step you can take to ensure the survival and prosperity of our family." I did not flinch. I did not look away. I simply offered her a serene, unbothered smile, placed my linen napkin neatly beside my crystal water glass, and stood up from my chair. "Before anyone signs absolutely anything," I said, my voice completely steady and cutting through the heavy air like a scalpel, "I have something I need to share in the living room, without waiting for their permission or agreement." I picked up the remote control from the sideboard and pressed the power button. The massive flat-screen monitor I had set up earlier flared to life, casting a stark, bright glow across their confused faces. I pressed play. The screen immediately displayed high-definition security footage. The bright white timestamp in the corner read a Tuesday from 3 weeks ago, at exactly 10 in the morning. The video showed Celeste standing on my front porch, sliding her copied brass key into my door, and walking inside when she knew with absolute certainty that I was sitting in a corporate office miles away. The next clip cut to her leading the sharply dressed appraiser through my private home office. The next clip zoomed in on her pulling open my heavy oak filing cabinet, extracting my insurance documents, and meticulously taking photographs of every single page with her mobile phone. The final clip was the most damning of all. It was the porch recording from just days earlier. Her voice filled the room. When she signs it, the rest of the sentence landed like a confession none of them could take back. The dining room fell so dead silent that I could actually hear the faint ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway. The color drained entirely from Wesley's face. Meredith clamped a hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with absolute horror. Grant sat frozen in his chair, his jaw slacked in total disbelief. I walked back to the dining table and picked up the first heavy stack of printed papers from the kitchen counter. I dropped it squarely in the center of the mahogany table. "Those are the email threads directly between Grant and the commercial lending officer," I announced, looking directly at my husband. "They prove that Grant actively submitted my separate, inherited property as the primary collateral for Wesley's bridge loan. He sent them my tax records and my renovation receipts." I picked up the second stack of papers and dropped it right next to the first with a heavy thud. "And that is a certified, legally binding report from my forensic accountant," I continued, my voice rising just enough to command the entire room. "It confirms that the Mercer family has invested exactly $0 into the maintenance, taxation, or renovation of this historic property. You have absolutely no legal, moral, or financial claim to it whatsoever." Celeste's face contorted into a mask of furious indignation. Her perfectly constructed facade shattered into a million jagged pieces. She slammed her hands flat on the table and stood up. "You have no right to film me in this house," Celeste hissed, her southern charm completely vaporized. "I am your family. I was simply trying to protect our collective assets. I was trying to save my son from a financial disaster because you were too blind and selfish to offer your help willingly." Right on cue. The heavy wooden pocket doors leading to the parlor slid open. Evelyn Cross stepped into the dining room, flanked by the independent financial auditor I had hired. They had let themselves in through the side door I had left unlocked for them exactly 20 minutes prior. Evelyn adjusted her glasses and looked at Celeste with the cold, dead eyes of a shark smelling blood in the water. "Actually, Mrs. Mercer," Evelyn stated, her tone sharp and completely devoid of emotion. "Assuming managerial authority over a property you do not own, facilitating the unauthorized entry of commercial appraisers, and secretly photographing private financial records constitutes unlawful entry, unauthorized access to private records, and serious civil exposure. My client has every legal right to secure her premises." The paperwork consultant quietly closed his briefcase, realizing instantly that he was sitting in the middle of a massive legal minefield. I walked over to Celeste and placed a single, freshly printed sheet of paper directly in front of her. "This is a formal, legally binding notice of no trespass," I told her. "If you ever step foot on this property again, the local police will be called immediately." Then, I walked over to the head of the table where Grant was sitting. His hands were visibly shaking. I placed the thin white envelope directly onto his empty dinner plate. "Those are legal separation papers," I said, looking down at the man I had foolishly promised to spend my life with, "along with the confirmation that I have entirely severed your access to our joint checking and savings accounts. And just so there is absolutely no lingering confusion regarding the collateral for the brewery, I legally transferred the deed of this townhouse into the Sinclair House Trust exactly 14 days ago. This house is locked tight. It will never save your brother." Wesley suddenly stood up, knocking his chair backward onto the hardwood floor. He ran his hands over his face, breathing heavily, completely overwhelmed by the realization that his business was officially dead. Grant looked up at me, his eyes pleading, his face pale and slick with cold sweat. Celeste, however, simply stared at me, for the very first time since I'd met her. She looked genuinely outplayed. She looked at the cameras, the legal documents, and the attorney standing in the room. "Since when?" Celeste demanded, her voice trembling with raw, unfiltered fury. "Since when did you start planning all of this behind our backs?" I looked her dead in the eyes and smiled. "Since the exact day you walked into my house and no longer considered me its owner." Grant scrambled to his feet, reaching out to grab my arm. I stepped back quickly, disgusted by his touch. "Parker, please," he begged, his voice cracking. "Please, can we just go upstairs and talk about this in private? We can work this out. I was just trying to help my brother. My mother pushed me into this. You know how she is." I did not give him the satisfaction of a private negotiation. I was not going to let him twist his profound betrayal into a quiet, manageable misunderstanding behind closed doors. "No, Grant," I said loudly, ensuring every single person in the room heard my final verdict. "We are not talking in private. The thing that completely destroyed our marriage was not your mother's brass key. It was the fact that you stood there and silently held the front door wide open for her." I stepped back and gestured toward the foyer. "Every single one of you needs to leave my house right now." No one argued. The evidence was insurmountable, the legal threats were absolute, and the total humiliation was suffocating. Wesley and Meredith walked out first, keeping their heads down. The accountant and the notary followed quickly behind them, eager to escape the fallout. Grant tried to say my name one last time, but Evelyn stepped between us, pointing firmly toward the exit. He finally turned and walked out into the humid night air. Celeste was the last to leave. She grabbed her designer handbag and walked toward the front door. She did not say a word to me. As she crossed the threshold, I pressed a button on my mobile phone. The new smart lock system engaged instantly, the heavy steel deadbolt sliding into place with a loud, satisfying mechanical clack. She stood on the front porch, staring at the thick wooden door. She had no key, she had no power, and she had absolutely no story left to twist the truth. I stood in the center of my beautiful historic foyer and listened. For the first time in many years, The house was completely, beautifully silent. It was a deep, settling quiet. The exact kind of peace that can only exist in a place that truly, undeniably belongs to you. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Please leave a comment down below and let me know where you are listening from so we can interact and share our thoughts. Do not forget to subscribe to the Helena Revenge Stories channel. Like this video, and support me further by pressing the hype button so that the story in this video can be heard by many more people.